For decades, education was sold as a guarantee: study hard, get a degree, build a future. But something broke, quietly. Today, more educated people feel stuck than ever. This isn't because they failed, it's because the system changed and nobody updated the rules. Education once worked, not because it was fair, not because it was kind, and not because it was designed to make everyone successful, but because it was built for a very specific world, a slower world, a more predictable world, a world where time moved differently and where change arrived gradually instead of all at once. In that world, information was expensive, access was limited, and opportunity was controlled by a small number of institutions that acted as gates, not as factories, meaning that getting through those gates already separated you from the majority of people who never even had the chance to try. Universities were not everywhere, degrees were not common, and completing education was not something society expected from everyone, which meant that when someone actually managed to finish, that achievement carried weight, not because of what was learned inside classrooms, but because of what had been endured along the way. A degree did not signal brilliance, creativity, or even intelligence. It signaled something much more important for the system of that time, which was compliance, patience, and the ability to delay gratification for years without immediate reward, qualities that fit perfectly into an economy built on long careers, stable companies, and predictable progress. Employers did not need to deeply analyze candidates because the education system had already done the filtering for them, removing those who could not follow rules, could not sit still, could not perform repetitive tasks, or could not survive years of structured obedience. In a world of factories, offices, and hierarchical organizations, this filtering mechanism was extremely efficient because companies did not want innovators. They wanted reliable operators, people who would show up every day, do what was required, and slowly move upward without questioning the structure they were placed in. Education worked because careers were linear, meaning that effort invested early almost always paid off later. Loyalty was rewarded, stability was realistic, and patience was not just a moral virtue but a practical strategy for survival. If you entered the system early enough, followed instructions closely enough, and stayed consistent long enough, progress was almost guaranteed, not because you were exceptional, but because the system itself was designed to move compliant individuals forward over time. This is why education felt safe, because it reduced uncertainty, removed the need for constant decision-making, and replaced risk with routine, allowing people to plan their lives years in advance, confident that the path in front of them would still exist by the time they reached the end of it. Parents trusted education not because they understood systems, but because they had personally experienced a version of the world where this trade-off made sense, where sacrificing youth in exchange for future stability actually delivered on its promise. Teachers reinforced this belief not out of malice, but because they themselves were products of the same system, rewarded for maintaining structure, discipline, and continuity rather than adaptation or disruption. Society as a whole aligned around this agreement, creating a feedback loop where education produced workers, workers produced economic growth, and economic growth reinforced trust in education as the primary engine of progress. But hidden inside this success was a condition that almost nobody noticed at the time, which was that education only worked as long as scarcity existed, as long as not everyone could participate, as long as credentials remained rare enough to function as meaningful signals in the marketplace. Once that scarcity disappeared, the signal weakened and the entire system began to drift without realizing it, still operating on old assumptions while the environment around it slowly transformed. At the time, no one questioned this transformation because from the inside, everything still looked normal. Degrees were still being awarded, careers were still being advertised, and success stories were still being highlighted, even though the underlying mechanics were already changing. Education did not fail suddenly, it aged quietly, continuing to function as designed while the world it was built for gradually vanished, leaving behind a generation that followed the rules perfectly, only to discover that the reward structure had already shifted. As education began to expand, almost no one questioned whether expansion itself could change the meaning of what education represented, because expansion felt like progress. It felt fair, it felt moral, and it felt necessary in a world that wanted to believe opportunity could be evenly distributed without consequences. More universities were built, more programs were created, more degrees were offered, and more people were encouraged and sometimes pressured to believe that higher education was no longer optional but required, not as a tool, but as a baseline expectation for participation in modern society. At first, this shift appeared positive, because access increased, diversity increased, and more people were allowed into spaces that had previously been closed to them, which created the illusion that the system was improving, even though the incentives underneath were quietly being rewritten. When credentials became common, they stopped functioning as signals of distinction and instead became signals of compliance, meaning that a degree no longer communicated that someone stood out, only that they met the minimum standard required to be considered, which fundamentally changed how education interacted with the market. A degree stopped opening doors and started preventing rejection, which is a subtle but devastating shift, because when something only protects you from exclusion, it no longer moves you forward, it only keeps you from falling behind. At the same time, the cost of education began to rise far beyond inflation, wages, or productivity, normalizing debt as a prerequisite for adulthood and quietly redefining financial pressure as a rite of passage rather than a systemic failure. Years of time were invested not in adaptation, not in experimentation, but in preparation for certainty, even as certainty itself was disappearing from the economic landscape, creating a situation where people entered the world already behind, already constrained, and already exhausted. Education continued producing graduates at scale, but the environment that once absorbed them smoothly was no longer there, and instead of slowing down to reassess, the system accelerated, producing more credentials in response to diminishing returns. The signal didn't disappear overnight, it diluted gradually, and because dilution happened slowly, most people didn't notice until the outcome no longer matched the expectation they had been promised. While education remained structured, slow, and standardized, the economy began to change in ways that education was neither designed to predict nor capable of responding to in real time, because institutions move slowly and markets do not wait. Technology compressed time, reduced barriers, and removed gatekeepers, making information abundant and skills easier to access, which meant that the value of knowing something declined while the value of applying it quickly increased. The market stopped rewarding credentials as proof of readiness and started rewarding outcomes as proof of competence, a shift that education never fully adapted to because it was built to evaluate effort, not results. Speed replaced patience as the dominant advantage, adaptability replaced loyalty, and positioning replaced seniority, creating a landscape where those who moved first gained leverage while those who waited for permission fell behind. Education continued teaching people how to follow instructions, meet requirements, and wait for validation, even as the economy began rewarding those who bypassed instruction entirely and learned through iteration, experimentation, and failure. This created a collision between expectation and reality, where graduates entered the workforce believing stability was the default outcome of compliance, only to discover that instability had become the norm. When the promised outcomes failed to materialize, the system did not accept responsibility, instead shifting the burden onto individuals by reframing structural change as personal inadequacy. People were told they chose the wrong major, the wrong school, or the wrong path, even though the path itself had changed after they committed to it, making the rules visible only in hindsight. The most damaging consequence of this shift was not economic, but psychological, because when systems fail quietly, individuals internalize the blame, assuming that effort without reward must indicate personal deficiency rather than structural misalignment. People responded by working harder, studying longer, collecting more credentials, and delaying life even further, believing that additional sacrifice would eventually unlock the outcome they were promised, even as evidence suggested otherwise. This cycle produced chronic exhaustion, quiet resentment, and a persistent sense of inadequacy, not dramatic enough to be publicly acknowledged, but heavy enough to drain motivation over time. Instead of questioning incentives, people questioned their worth, assuming that if success was not arriving, it must be because they were not enough, rather than because the system no longer rewarded what it trained them to do. The system survived this transition precisely because it redirected frustration inward, allowing structural failure to masquerade as an individual responsibility, which preserved institutional legitimacy while eroding personal confidence. Burnout became normalized, dissatisfaction became internalized, and ambition slowly turned into anxiety, as people continued investing effort into a structure that no longer multiplied it. In the current system, effort alone is no longer the primary multiplier, because the system now rewards leverage, positioning, timing, and environment more than persistence or credentials. Where you apply effort matters more than how much effort you apply, and those who move fastest are often not the smartest or the most educated, but the least constrained by outdated assumptions. People who are not anchored to traditional paths adapt earlier, reposition faster, and compound results sooner, not because they possess superior talent, but because they respond to incentives as they are, not as they were. Education still has value, but it no longer functions as insurance, only as a tool, and tools are only useful when applied in environments that reward their use. Those who succeed today understand systems intuitively, even if they cannot articulate them, sensing where momentum exists and moving toward it before certainty appears. This is not unfairness, it is misalignment, and misalignment always punishes those who remain loyal to obsolete rules. The anger people feel is not about money, status, or comparison, but about broken agreements because education was never sold as a gamble, it was sold as a promise. Sacrifice now, live later was the implicit contract, and when later never arrived, people experienced not disappointment, but betrayal. Systems rarely announce when contracts expire, they simply stop honoring them, leaving participants to discover the change only after committing years of their lives. This creates confusion, resentment, and distrust, because people followed the rules exactly as instructed, only to be told retroactively that the rules had changed. The pain comes not from failure, but from realizing that loyalty was rewarded with irrelevance. Education is no longer a guarantee, it is a variable, one input among many, and treating it as protection rather than as a tool leads to stagnation rather than security. The real question is no longer what to study, but where effort still multiplies because some environments accelerate growth while others quietly drain it regardless of intelligence, discipline, or intention. Understanding systems matters more than mastering content because content without context decays quickly, while system awareness compounds over time. The next video explores where momentum still exists, why certain environments attract opportunity, and how individuals can position themselves without abandoning effort, but by placing it where it actually matters. This is not about escaping work, it is about aligning work with reality.